Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into a world that smells faintly of smoke, wet wool, and old wood. You've wandered into a medieval village just before dusk. The roofs are thatched, the pigs are loose, and people eye you sideways. Not because of what you're wearing, but because it's Tuesday. And worse, you look clean. A pair of muddy children run past you giggling, and you hear someone mutter behind a shuttered window, "Didn't anyone tell them what happened last time someone bathed on a Tuesday?" You chuckle, assuming it's just local gossip. But when you ask a man in the market square where the public bathhouse is, his expression changes from polite to pale. He leans in close and says, "Don't go near it today. Not after what happened to Martha." Then he just walks off. You're not entirely sure who Martha is, or what happened to her, but you start to notice that everyone else is unusually grimy. Hair clumped, nails black, and the smell, like pickled onions and damp blankets, lingers like a curse. You think back to what you've read. Bathhouses in the medieval period weren't just for getting clean, they were social spaces, kind of like a mix between a cafe, a spa, and a gossip hall. People met there to relax, share stew, and occasionally more private activities, so why ban them on one specific day? You find an old woman selling dried leeks, and when you ask her about the Tuesday rule, she laughs with a mouthful of gaps. Well, there's two reasons, she says. One practical, one less so. She tells you the practical reason first. The town only has one well and it's shallow. On Mondays, people clean everything, clothes, linens, themselves. The bathhouse fills up fast, the fires burn hot, and water usage spikes. If people bathe again on Tuesday, the town runs dry before Thursday, which is laundry day. So Tuesday became the official no-bathing buffer. You nod. That makes sense. Water was life in those days. Wells were temperamental, rivers were often polluted, and rain didn't always come when it should. Then she leans closer, lowers her voice, and says, "But the other reason? The murder." You raise an eyebrow. "Murder?" "Oh yes," she says. "Years ago, the apothecary's daughter, Martha, was found dead in the bathhouse. On a Tuesday. Water still warm, candle still lit, no signs of struggle, just gone. Folks say her ghost hates the smell of rosemary soap now." You're about to laugh, but then you notice there's a small bundle of dried rosemary hanging above the bathhouse door, and a charm, and salt. Whether it's for saving water or saving souls, you don't know. But no one here bathes on Tuesdays. Not anymore. You pass the bathhouse later, just as twilight fades. It's locked. The windows are fogged up, even though no one's inside. And for a moment you swear you see a flicker of movement behind the glass, like someone rising from water, hair heavy and dark. Probably just your imagination. Probably. You walk away a little quicker than before. The next morning you wake early, mostly because the town cockerel seems to have no snooze button, and decide to dig a little deeper. The bathhouse is still shut tight, its latch crusted with rust and rosemary sprigs freshly replaced. You follow your nose to the bakery instead, where a red-faced man kneads dough like it owes him money. He's covered in flour from elbow to eyebrow, and when you casually ask about the Tuesday bathing ban, he doesn't even look up. "Still on about that," he mutters. "Can't keep a secret in this town. You'd think Martha died last week." So it's not just old wives' tales then. The whole town treats the rule like holy writ. You press a bit more, and the baker eventually relents, giving you the real reason. Not the ghost story, not the water shortage, but something far more medieval. Plague. "It wasn't always about one girl," he says, slapping dough onto a board. "Back when the sweating sickness came through, folk noticed a strange thing. People who bathed too often, especially on consecutive days, got sicker, faster. Fever took 'em like a fox in a henhouse." He shrugs. "Of course we know now it wasn't the bathing, it was the steam. Closed windows, crowded rooms, one sick person in the bathhouse, and you might as well kiss your lungs goodbye." You blink. The ghost story had a certain eerie charm, but this is brutal epidemiology. It actually tracks with some historical understanding. While modern medicine didn't exist back then, medieval people weren't stupid. They observed patterns, and even if they misunderstood the cause, Miasmas, humours, planetary misalignment, they still notice correlations. Too many people bathing in one space, on the same days. Death followed. So they spaced it out. They gave the bathhouse a day to cool. A kind of medieval quarantine. As the baker shoves his dough into a roaring oven, he adds one last detail. Anyway, if you're really clean, folk assume you're either hiding something or French. Neither's a good look. You laugh, unsure if he's joking. But it hits you. Cleanliness wasn't always a virtue. In some medieval towns, public bathing was associated with sin, indulgence, even treason. To smell of rosewater in the wrong century was to invite suspicion, not admiration. You walk the streets a bit more, watching as townsfolk scrub benches, sweep doorsteps, even rake horse droppings into neat little piles. But no one washes themselves. Not until Wednesday. And as strange as it seems, it works. There's a kind of rhythm to it. Bathing becomes a ritual, a community event, something to look forward to, prepare for. Clothes get washed, pots are scrubbed. People light lavender or burn dried mint to mask the in-between stench. You remember the woman from the market square, her missing teeth, her voice like gravel, and the way she smiled as she told you, "Some rules, child, were made by the living, others by the ones who never left." You decide, perhaps wisely, to wait until Wednesday for your own scrub, just in case Martha doesn't like the smell of modern shampoo. After all, in a town like this, superstition is just another word for survival. You don't notice the bells at first. They're soft, just a gentle, resonant thrum that blends with the bleating of sheep and the clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestone. But then you realise the sun hasn't even set, and already the townsfolk are packing up. Shopkeepers shutter their stalls. Women pull children indoors. A boy races past, shouting, "Curfew bells ringing!" Curfew? It's not even dark yet. You follow the sound to the centre of the village where a crooked iron bell swings lazily in a timber frame. A wrinkled man with shoulders like fence posts pulls the rope with practised rhythm, his expression unreadable. He nods to you once and continues ringing. You're not the only one confused. A traveller, judging by her long cloak and dusty boots, tries to buy bread from a baker just closing his shop. He refuses. "Curfew," he says, pointing to the bell as if it answers all questions. You ask an older woman what the rush is. She eyes you warily and says, "If your fire's not banked by sunset, your house is the next to burn." There's no further explanation, so you press for more. Eventually, over a tankard of ale at the Widow Run Tavern, remember the alewives, someone explains. The curfew bell comes from the old French couvre-feu, literally cover fire. It's not about bedtime, it's about not letting your thatch-roofed house become a torch. In a world without street lamps, fire departments, or fire retardant anything, open flames were everywhere, cooking, lighting, heating. And those fires, they didn't just burn wood, they burned families, entire neighbourhoods. Every evening the bell was rung to signal everyone in town to douse, cover or bank their hearth fires. Smother the flame, close the flue, pour water on coals. It wasn't negotiable. One unattended ember could jump to a rafter, then to the neighbour's roof, and by dawn your whole town would be ashes and bones. You think of modern fire codes, smoke alarms, sprinklers. None of that existed. What they had was a bell, and fear. Some towns even had patrolmen who'd knock on doors, checking for glowing embers or suspicious chimney smoke. If you broke curfew and your fire caused damage, punishment could be brutal. Fines, public shaming, or exile. In some cities, firebreak laws mandated how far apart homes had to be or which materials could be used. But this town, no exceptions. The bell rings, the fires die. And yet, as always, superstition sneaks in. One villager leans in conspiratorially and whispers that the bell's tone, deep and mournful, was designed to keep spirits away. According to local belief, fire attracts restless souls. The curfew bell not only prevents burning homes, it quiets wandering ones. You glance at the bell again. It swings more slowly now. Its song echoes through the alleyways like a warning from another world. You suddenly remember a detail from your own history classes. In Norman England, King William the Fat made curfew bells mandatory in towns across the realm. It was a public safety measure, yes, but also a way to instill uniform discipline. Sound the bell, end the noise, end the chaos. Order enforced by sound. So when the final toll fades and silence falls across the village, you realise this isn't bedtime, it's protection. By the time you wander back to your lodgings, the village has gone still. Eerily still. No footsteps, no laughter, not even the clink of a mug. Only the occasional creak of wood settling under its own weight. Even the dogs seem to have taken the hint. Inside the cottage, your host, a stout, sleepy-eyed woman who introduced herself only as Auntie, is carefully sliding a heavy iron lid over the hearth. You offer to help, but she waves you off. "Don't want the chimney drawing," she mutters, tapping the bricks with the side of a soot-blackened poker. "Last time someone left the coals open, we lost half the north row. Poor little Elmira never got out of the hayloft." You pause. "Wasn't that decades ago?" Auntie shrugs. "Fire doesn't keep calendars." That night, you lie on a straw mattress in the cold and marvel at the logic of it all. In a world lit entirely by flame, every person was a potential arsonist, by accident. A dropped taper, a gust of wind, an overfed hearth, and entire families could vanish before the rooster crowed. And yet, it wasn't just fear that kept the curfew bell alive. Over the generations, it had taken on a rhythm, a comfort. Children were raised by its chime. Couples timed their dinners by it. The last song in the tavern was always cut off mid-verse as the bell began. It gave the night a spine. What had begun as a harsh command had softened into ritual. Still, even rituals have teeth. You wake in the middle of the night to shouting in the distance. A red glow pulses faintly beyond the shuttered window. Auntie is already up, clutching a jug of water in one hand, a wool blanket in the other. "Smithy's boy left the forge hot again," she mutters, shoving boots on her feet. Fool child. That bell didn't ring for his amusement. You follow her to the door. Outside, villagers sprint in all directions, forming a bucket line. You watch as steam hisses off stone and shouts rise through the dark. And then, it's over. The fire is caught, contained. The village exhales. By dawn, the bell hangs still and soot-streaked faces gather near it, not to punish the boy, but to remind him. An elder speaks a few solemn words about loss, responsibility, and the cost of forgetting. The boy's face burns brighter than the flames ever did. You realise then, the bell isn't just metal and noise, it's memory. A warning passed down like bread or songs. Something forged from fire and fear and love for the living. Later, as you step through the quiet lanes, the day begins again. Stalls open, doors creak, fires are carefully, cautiously lit. Life continues, under the watchful shadow of a bell no one dares ignore. And when twilight comes again, you already know what's coming. You'll hear that low, mournful toll drift through the mist and feel a little safer, not because it's bedtime, because it's protection. The next day, you wander into the village bakery, lured by the scent of something warm, yeasty and slightly burnt, like a sourdough that's had a rough morning. Inside, the baker is pulling loaves from a stone oven, with the kind of reverence normally reserved for newborns or relics. You're hungry, famished really. And when you point to the warmest, freshest-looking loaf on the rack, the baker gives you a look like you just kicked his dog. "That one's for tomorrow," he says flatly. You blink. "But it's just come out." He sighs like he's said this 1,000 times and still can't believe people keep forgetting. "It has to sit," he mutters, placing the steaming loaf high on a shelf. "Can't eat bread the same day it's baked. That's how accidents happen." You glance around, half expecting to see signs warning about fresh bread hazards. Instead, you see shelf after shelf of yesterday's loaves, firm, slightly misshapen, their crusts as solid as roofing tiles. You pick one up. It's hard. Really hard. You could build a wall with these things. The baker sees your face and chuckles. "Oh, that's the good stuff. Proper trencher bread." He explains, in this town and many like it, bread wasn't just food, it was plate, spoon, sponge, napkin, and finally, pig feed. These thick, day-old slices, called trenchers, were the medieval equivalent of dinnerware. You piled stew on them, used them to sop up gravy, and at the end of the meal, handed the soggy remains to the poor, or pigs, or both. The harder the bread, the better it held up. Soft bread. That was wasteful, messy, suspicious. You ask him if people ever bake soft, fluffy loaves just for eating. He winces. Only the French do that, he says, and look where it got them. You laugh, but the message is clear. In this part of the world, softness equals softness, and softness, in hard times, is a liability. There's something else too, something darker. The baker lowers his voice and tells you a story from his father's time. Once, a nobleman visiting from the city requested fresh bread, demanded it. The town's bakers obliged, baking through the night, presenting warm loaves at dawn. The nobleman took one bite and collapsed. Poison. But not because someone laced the bread. No, it was the flour. Poorly aged. The humidity of the baking chamber had reactivated spores. Ergot, they whispered. The same fungus that made peasants hallucinate and vomit, that turned bread into madness. It thrived in moist, improperly stored rye, and the fresher the bread, the more dangerous it could be. So the town made a rule: no bread eaten on the day it's baked. Not just tradition, survival. You glance back at the steaming loaf on the shelf. Still warm, still off limits. You suddenly want it less. It's strange, isn't it? In your own time, nothing's more luxurious than warm, crusty bread. But here, the luxury is in waiting, in letting it go cold and hard so it can be safely soaked, sliced, and survived. By the time you leave the bakery, you carry a loaf so dense it could double as a weapon. It smells faintly of ashen barley, and strangely, you trust it more. You carry your dense, day-old loaf through the village like it's a family heirloom. Awkward, slightly unwieldy, and absolutely necessary. You stop at a wooden bench near the square, tear off a corner with effort that makes your knuckles ache, and gnaw thoughtfully. It's chewy. Not bad, just stubborn, like it wants you to prove you're worthy of the carbs. Across the square, a group of children are playing some sort of game involving sticks, stones, and surprisingly elaborate insults. One of them whips a stale crust at another. It bounces harmlessly off his shoulder and lands with a hollow thud. The victim picks it up and starts chewing on it anyway. You're starting to get it now. The bread isn't meant to delight, it's meant to last, and it's meant to be shared. A travelling friar sits beside you and pulls a similar brickloaf from his satchel. He nods at yours approvingly. "Good crumb," he says, tapping it like a melon. "Where'd you get it?" You point to the bakery. "Ah, old Bartel," he says. "Knows what he's doing. Didn't give you any of that same-day heresy, did he?" You raise an eyebrow. He's joking. Probably. But then the friar leans in and tells you something that makes your stomach twist. In the years of poor harvests, some bakers cheated. They added chalk, sawdust, even powdered bones to stretch their flour. The worst of it, you couldn't always taste the difference until you started coughing blood. That's why some towns, like this one, required every baker to follow the assize of bread, a medieval regulation that dated back to the 13th century. It controlled not just the price of bread, but its weight, size, and contents. Bakers who violated it could be fined, pilloried, or forced to eat their own faulty wares. You suddenly look at your loaf with new respect. This thing has been measured, tested, watched. It's a product of survival, engineered not for comfort, but for consistency. If there's anything medieval people feared more than a famine, it was a dishonest baker. The friar tears his loaf in half and offers you a piece of salted lard to smear on yours. It's not a feast, but it feels deeply human. Rough bread, greasy fat, and a silence between strangers that somehow tastes like trust. Later that evening, as you sit near the hearth in the tavern, you notice something strange. No one eats bread right away. Stews come out, roasted roots, even pickled eggs. But the bread, it sits, it waits. People tear off chunks only when the main meal is nearly done, using it like a spoon, a napkin, or a final course. And when they're done, they don't toss it. Some feed the rest to their dogs, others collect it in a basket for beggars. One old man slips his into his pocket with the care of someone saving a charm. In this world, nothing goes to waste, not even a dry crust. So you bite down again, jaw aching, but heart full. The bread might be stale, but the rule behind it, fresh as ever. You've barely digested your brickloaf breakfast when another rule finds you, this time in the form of your own socks. You're admiring a pair of bright blue and mustard-striped hose hanging from a stall near the edge of the marketplace. They're oddly cheerful in a town that otherwise seems committed to a palette of mud and moss. You reach out, fingertips grazing the coarse wool, when the stallkeeper snaps his hand over yours like a mousetrap. "Not for you," he hisses. You blink. "I was just looking." He glances around nervously. "Look with your eyes, not your station." You frown. Station. You're not sure whether to be offended or flattered. Then a loud voice cuts through the tension. A man in an absurdly tall hat, wearing hose the colour of pickled beetroot. He strolls past as if he owns the street. The vendor bows slightly. "Now we can wear stripes," the stallkeeper mutters. "Landed gentry." It clicks. You've stumbled into the strange, colourful world of sumptuary laws. Rules that dictated exactly what you were allowed to wear based on your class, income, or social position. Want to wear silk? Not unless you're nobility. Want red dye? Better have a title. Want stripes on your socks? Only if you've got enough land to justify the flair. You laugh, quietly. The idea of government-regulated fashion seems like a medieval satire until you realise the purpose: visual control. In a time when reading was rare and social mobility was dangerous, clothes did the talking. Who you were needed to be obvious from 50 paces. If a peasant dressed like a noble, he could demand better treatment, cheat in court, or, God forbid, flirt above his level. So the laws were strict and oddly specific. In 1363, for instance, an English statute forbade servants from wearing cloth worth more than 2 shillings a yard. Only knights could wear velvet. Only earls could wear imported furs. And hose, those bold, colourful leg coverings, were regulated right down to their width and colour. The result? A walking caste system enforced by your own wardrobe. You glance down at your travel-worn boots and plain brown tunic. You look peasant-adjacent, which in this town probably keeps you safe. But you can't help but be intrigued. Why striped socks? A grizzled woman sweeping the tavern steps offers you a theory. "Stripes draw the eye," she says. "They say, 'Look at me.'" Not something a stable boy needs, you nod. In fact, in some regions, stripes were once associated with criminals and outcasts, visually disruptive, hard to track, suspicious. But as fashion evolved, so did meaning. The wealthy started to own stripes, not just on socks, but sleeves, doublets, even hats. Of course, if a poor man copied that style, fines, stocks, in extreme cases, confiscation of property, over socks. The stallkeeper, now mollified, lets you handle a pair of dull grey hose. Safe, he says, unoffensive. They feel like cold porridge and look worse, but you get it now. In this world, even your ankles can commit treason. Later that afternoon, you spot a young boy racing through the square with striped hose bunched up around his ankles, laughing as he darts between wagons. He's caught moments later by a sharp-nosed woman who seizes him by the ear and scolds him in hushed fury. The hose! Snatched off his legs and bundled up tight like contraband. It's not just fashion, it's contraband. And suddenly you see it everywhere. A merchant with an extra deep collar quickly flips it inward as a knight passes. A woman on her way to church tugs a veil further down her shoulders. Fine silk, a little too shiny for someone without a title. Even children are dressed with caution. No garish dyes, no elaborate stitching. All plain and brown like walking loaves of rye. You stop by a small tailor's shop tucked between a tannery and a fishmonger's stall. Inside, the air smells of lye and lavender. Bolts of fabric are stacked in neat piles labelled in looping script. For clergy, for commoners, for knights' wives only. You ask the tailor, an elderly man with ink-stained fingers, how he keeps track of who's allowed to wear what. He doesn't look up. I keep a copy of the register, he says simply. The law lists who may wear silk, who may wear sable, and who must wear sackcloth. I make no mistakes. I like my ears where they are. It sounds absurd, until he shows you a well-worn ledger, bound in cracked leather, filled with line after line of textile codes and fines. He points to one note. A merchant's daughter wore ermine cuffs in the presence of the bishop's sister. Public flogging, 2 shillings fine. You blink. For cuffs? He nods. She bled on the fur. It was very dramatic. You realise then that these laws weren't just about control. They were about drama, envy, jealousy, public theatre, everyone watching everyone else ready to pounce at the first sign of upward fashion fraud. And beneath it all, a quiet truth hums. In a rigid society, clothing is revolution. One wrong hem, one too fancy button, and suddenly you're not knowing your place. You're pretending, and pretending, especially in public, was dangerous. Back outside, a scribe in ink-streaked robes gives you a knowing look as you pass. The king's tailor wears wool and linen, he mutters, but the king's mistress wears French lace. Tell me who has the power. You think of the striped socks again. So cheerful, so petty, so powerful. That night at the tavern you see a young woman quietly darning a pair of bright green hose beneath the table. When she notices you watching, she doesn't hide it. She just winks. "Just for the woods," she whispers. "Where the sheriff can't see." You grin. Because even in a world of rules, some people still dare to wear colour where they're not supposed to. And in the quiet rebellion of socks, there's something timeless. It's a fine morning when love gets complicated. Not because of who you love, but when. You're seated on a stone bench outside the village chapel, watching as 2 nervous young sweethearts rehearse what looks like a very modest wedding. A borrowed ribbon, a wilted flower crown. He's fiddling with his tunic hem. She's clutching a loaf of cheese like it's a bouquet. Everything seems ready. But then the priest arrives, robes fluttering like angry flags, and puts a swift stop to it. "No weddings this week," he snaps, before storming off toward the rectory. The couple stands there stunned. A rooster crows awkwardly. You're as confused as they are, so you ask a passing midwife what just happened. "Saints' days," she says, as if that explains everything. You give her a look. She sighs. You can't just get married whenever you fancy. Not during Lent, not during Advent, not on certain feast days, not near Michaelmas or Candlemas or All Hallows' Eve. That's sacred time. No kissing, no singing, and definitely no "I do." You blink. That's a lot of no. Turns out, in medieval Europe, marriage was tightly regulated by the church, not just in terms of how it happened, but when. The liturgical calendar, already stuffed with saints, fasts, vigils, and feast days, acted like a giant mood ring for your love life. Out of the 365 days in a year, nearly half were considered spiritually inappropriate for weddings. That included all of Lent, about 40 days, Advent, another 4 weeks, the 40 days after Easter, and several days surrounding major feasts. Why? Because marriage was joyous, celebratory. It involved music, dancing, feasting, wine, and bedsheets. And those things had no place during periods of religious solemnity. Weddings were seen as distractions, earthly indulgences that clashed with divine mourning or preparation. You sit with that for a moment. Love is fine, within reason, but timing is everything. A local miller's wife leans over from her vegetable stall and adds, "We waited 3 months to wed. Poor man nearly died of nerves. Wore a hole clean through his boots." You chuckle, but it's no joke. For many couples, forbidden wedding windows meant delays that risked pregnancies outside wedlock, or unions that lost their social momentum altogether. Some tried to sneak ceremonies through, bribing lesser priests or performing quiet hand-fasting ceremonies in barns and backfields. But if they were caught, the marriage could be annulled. Worse, fines, excommunication, or public penance. The church meant business. You recall a story from your own readings. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council ruled that weddings had to be announced in advance on 3 consecutive Sundays, called the banns, to prevent secret or hasty marriages. And still, even then, you had to make sure the calendar approved of your big day. It wasn't about love, it was about order. And saints came first. You catch up with the bride to almost be later that day. She's sitting by the well, veil discarded, ribbon unravelling, gnawing the corner of her cheese loaf like it wronged her. 3 more weeks, she mutters when you sit beside her, until St. Swithin's Day is done. Then maybe. You ask why they don't just do it anyway. A quiet ceremony, no fuss, she snorts. Try telling his mother that, or the priest, or my grandmother. She says if we wed during a black season, the cows will stop giving milk and my womb will dry up like salted cod. You weren't expecting that level of detail, but it's true. Aside from official church rules, folk beliefs and rural superstitions heavily influenced marriage timing. Some days were unlucky, some were cursed. Others were perfect, for blessings, fertility, prosperity, or just getting decent weather. Marrying on a Friday, bad luck. On a full moon, risky during harvest, selfish, you take workers from the fields. On May Day, fertile but scandalous, too fertile. And saints' days, that was a minefield. Each had their own mood. Some brought joy and abundance like St. Valentine or St. Agnes. Others were tied to martyrdom, bloodshed and heavenly wrath. Getting married on a martyr's feast day was like holding your honeymoon in a haunted house. The woman at the well flicks a beetle off her skirt. Anyway, she adds, the priest says St. Bartholomew was flayed alive, so it's not a good time to celebrate union. You try not to picture that during a wedding toast. In many towns, these beliefs had weight equal to canon law. Families tracked moon cycles, consulted almanacs, even hired local wise women to divine the luckiest dates. Marriage wasn't just legal or romantic, it was astrological, agricultural, mystical. The tavern keeper tells you a tale over dinner. Once, a couple tried to wed during Ember Days, a time of fasting and prayer. The bride broke into hives before the ceremony. The groom fell off a cart. The priest declared it a sign. They split. Coincidence? Maybe. But in a world where illness and misfortune struck without warning or explanation, people built rules to protect what little joy they had. Marriage was too important to leave to chance, so the lovers wait. They bake extra bread, stitch hems, practice steps. Maybe they'll wed at midsummer, under a saint with a cheerful reputation, or maybe they'll elope to a fishing village where no one checks the calendar. You smile as you pass the chapel again. Someone's tied wildflowers to the door. It's not a wedding, but it's hope. Because even when rules bend time around love, people find ways to wait with grace. Or if necessary, they wed in secret under the stars. You're strolling through the village market, enjoying the afternoon sunlight, when you feel something sharp wedge itself between your toes. You look down, a turnip. A half-rotted one, to be specific, and slick with something unidentifiable. It wasn't thrown, just lying there, abandoned in the middle of the square. But it's enough to make you stumble, arms flailing, dignity scattered. You hear a chuckle from a nearby stall. Should have worn shoes, a voice calls, or at least paid the tax. No, you glance around, bewildered. Everyone else is barefoot too, except the man who spoke. He's in a stall behind a low wooden counter, his boots polished and smugly tied. You limp over to him. Is there some shoe ban I should know about, you ask? He doesn't answer right away, just points toward a stone slab near the edge of the square, weathered with time and stained by centuries. There's writing on it, but the carving's so shallow you can barely read it, until someone else whispers beside you, "By ducal decree no shoes shall be worn in the square on market day, so saith the turnip incident." That's not a joke. Not long ago, well, a few generations maybe, a duke from a neighbouring estate visited this very town to inspect the market. The story goes that he slipped on a greasy root vegetable, fell backward into a goose cart and broke 2 ribs and what little remained of his patience. Rather than blame poor road maintenance or the goose, he blamed footwear, specifically slick soles that gave no grip on the cobblestone. And because a duke's humiliation was never his fault, he issued a decree. On market days, all visitors and vendors must go barefoot in the central square, supposedly for traction. Realistically, out of spite. And here's the kicker. The law stuck. Over time, the original reason faded into myth, but the barefoot market rule endured. It was said to prevent slips, keep the stones cleaner, and, according to one enthusiastic tanner, strengthen the souls of peasants so they may better endure God's earth. You're sceptical until you step back onto the stones. They're warm from the sun, worn smooth in the centre, but still rough around the edges. There's a rhythm to walking them barefoot, a strange intimacy between foot and stone. You feel every pebble, every dip, and somehow it works. Even the fishmonger agrees. "You think I want to get herring guts on my good boots?" he says, slapping a trout onto his stall. "This way's better. Just don't stub your toe on the cheese cart." You pass a young girl skipping barefoot through puddles near the fountain. Her mother watches with amusement, basket on one hip, and says, "She won't need shoes till Easter. Her arches are better than mine already." Still, not everyone agrees. A visiting merchant, clearly not local, strides through the square in soft leather boots and draws more glares than a rooster at midnight. A boy chases after him with a ladle, tapping the man's shin and shouting, "Fine or no pie." You don't know what that means, but it feels official. As the barefoot rule starts to sink in, literally thanks to the gravel near the pickle stand, you begin to see the logic behind it, or at least the peculiar kind of logic that medieval towns specialised in. Part superstition, part custom, part someone important once said so and no one dared undo it. You pass by a cobbler's workshop, expecting it to be empty on market day. But inside, the cobbler is busy, just not with shoes. He's sewing leather covers for carts, sharpening a tool and singing a tune about saints and splinters. When you ask him whether the barefoot law hurts business, he waves a dismissive hand. "Oh no," he says, "I make better coin on Mondays, when people come in with blisters." He gestures to a small pile of shoes tucked behind the counter. That's the market stash. Folks drop them off here before stepping onto the square. I polish, they buy turnips, everyone's happy. You glance down at your own scratched feet and wonder how many tetanus cases it would take for the town to reconsider. Then again, this town has weathered worse, and the barefoot rule, like so many others, has morphed over time. It's no longer just about a grumpy duke and a vegetable vendetta. It's become tradition, a kind of badge of belonging. Outsiders wear shoes, locals walk free. A farmer nearby tells you with pride, "My grandfather walked this market square every Thursday for 60 years, rain or shine, barefoot. Claimed he could tell the harvest would be good by how the stones felt in April." You're not sure whether that's folklore or foot trauma. Possibly both. Of course, not every town enforced their rules with such tactile enthusiasm. In some places, the barefoot tradition was linked to humility. Monks walked without shoes as an act of piety. Beggars walked barefoot to elicit charity. A shoeless merchant might signal poverty or penitence. But here, it's just about not falling on your backside because of a rogue root vegetable. That's the story everyone agrees on. Well, almost everyone. An elderly woman who sells cider from a barrel claims the true reason involves a curse, one placed by a wandering herbalist who slipped in the square and declared that all who trod in leather would carry the sin of her fall. Since then, anyone who wore shoes on a Thursday market was said to sprout warts shaped like cabbages. No one seems to believe her, but no one's risking it either. You walk a little slower after that, not because your feet hurt, they do, but because you're realising just how much these strange rules reveal about the people who live here. It's not just about control or punishment. It's about rhythm, ritual, a way of navigating the chaos of life with certainty, even if that certainty involves cold toes and turnip lore. So when the sun begins to dip and the stalls pack up, you find your way back to the cobbler, retrieve your shoes, and slide them on with a sigh of deep personal victory. And in that moment you understand something. Sometimes putting your shoes back on feels like earning them. It's Sunday morning and the village is humming, not with hymns or bells, but with the sharp twang of arrows slicing through air. You've barely stepped outside when a feathered shaft zips past your ear and thuds into a hay bale with alarming enthusiasm. A boy, no more than 10, cheers like he's won a joust. Behind him, an older man adjusts a longbow taller than he is and yells, "Keep your elbow up, or you'll gut your thumb!" You duck instinctively. Across the village green, dozens of townsfolk are lined up in neat rows, loosing arrows at painted targets. Some are in crisp formations, others wobble like drunken spiders. But they all have one thing in common. They're required to be there. Welcome to Mandatory Archery Sunday, a long-standing law in many medieval towns across England and parts of Europe. If you're a male of fighting age, you're expected to spend your Sunday afternoon practicing archery. Rain or shine. No excuses. You wander toward the edge of the green and are quickly handed a bow by a no-nonsense woman with forearms like tree trunks. "Shoot or get fined," she says, not unkindly. "We take attendance." You raise an eyebrow. "Fined?" She nods. "A penny if you miss practice. 2 if you miss 2 in a row. And if you miss a month? Let's just say you won't be enjoying stew and peace for a while." Turns out this isn't just village sport, it's national defence. Back in 1363, King Edward III issued a law requiring all able-bodied Englishmen to practice archery every Sunday. It wasn't a suggestion. England's military might depended on the legendary English longbow, and the only way to keep the population ready was to turn the bow into a weekly chore. The law even went so far as to ban other games, like football, tennis and dice, because they distracted men from their archery duties. In some towns, balls and gaming boards were confiscated and burned to keep focus on the fletching. Here in this village, the tradition never died. Even the children are involved. Toddlers fire toy arrows at stuffed targets. Teenagers compete for distance. Old men lean on walking sticks and yell advice. One particularly wrinkled fellow smirks at you and says, "I haven't hit a bullseye since Henry IV, but I still count." There's a festive air to it, strangely enough. Families gather. Bread is shared. Ale flows freely after the practice ends, and underneath it all a quiet understanding. When the time comes, they'll be ready. Because back then, war wasn't far away. Raids, skirmishes, civil unrest. They were always just a horizon away. Training every Sunday wasn't paranoia. It was policy. If your village was attacked, you didn't wait for nights. You were the army. And so the law persisted. Even centuries later, some places maintained it as local tradition, a sort of civic memory carved into muscle and string. You draw back your own bow awkwardly and release. The arrow sails, well, more like flutters, before planting itself in the grass a good 10 paces short. Someone claps anyway. "Better than the baker," a voice says behind you. You're not sure if that's a compliment, but you take it. Because in a world where survival depended on the string and stave, showing up with sore arms was better than staying home with soft hands. After your less than glorious archery debut, you retire to a shaded bench beneath an ash tree, where the village clerk is busy recording scores with an ink-stained thumb. He's got a wooden ledger open and is frowning at a column labelled "Absentees." You lean in. They really keep track. He doesn't look up. Of course, it's the law. A village that forgets to aim soon forgets to defend. You can't help but admire the phrasing, both poetic and slightly terrifying. The clerk explains that in past centuries, particularly during the 100 Years' War, English victories were often credited to their longbowmen. Archers could fire 6 arrows per minute with deadly precision, raining volleys that broke cavalry charges and shredded infantry formations. The weapon turned farmers into soldiers, but only if they practiced, relentlessly. And so, archery practice wasn't just encouraged, it was woven into life. If you were old enough to draw a bow, you were old enough to be useful, by law. There were even local competitions, sanctioned mini-tournaments with prizes like cured meat, ale, or, in some generous villages, a goose. But beneath the cheering and wagers, there was always an undercurrent of purpose. In this village, the tradition runs deep. A few women in their 40s are showing the younger lads how to brace their stance. One grins and says, "Learn to shoot when the monks tried to raise rents. Funny how fast a quill turns into a quarrel." She's only half joking. You hear stories whispered between shots of raids from rival towns, border disputes, even one legend where a band of poachers took over the mill until a group of determined archers drove them off using nothing but their practice bows and an alarming number of beehives. Later, you meet the blacksmith who sharpens arrowheads. He hands you one, blunted for practice but still unnervingly pointy. He explains how different tips were used: broadheads for unarmoured targets, bodkin points to pierce chainmail. He says it with the calmness of someone discussing spoons. What strikes you isn't the militarism, it's the normalcy. In a world without police, standing armies or early warning systems, defence was hyper-local. If danger came, it was up to you and your neighbours, with your muddy boots, mismatched tunics, and yes, your Sunday bow skills. Even now, hundreds of years later, that sense of shared responsibility lingers. Not out of fear, but habit, pride, ritual. As practice winds down, the final volleys are loosed, arrows flying in sharp arcs against the softening sky. Targets are collected, bows are unstrung. The mood turns from tense to celebratory. Someone brings out a jug of cider. Someone else starts a tune on a fiddle. Children chase one another with imaginary swords. And through it all you sense a kind of invisible thread tying these people together, not just to each other, but to the generations before them. Those who stood in the same field pulled the same string and hoped their arms would be strong enough when it mattered. You look down at your own hands, tender, untrained, but now just a little more calloused. A reminder that even in a sleepy village, every Sunday was once a preparation for war. You're halfway through a bowl of watery stew at the tavern when the door creaks open and the entire room falls silent. A hush spreads like spilled ink. Every head turns, and then you see it. A pig. A massive, mud-streaked sow waddles into the doorway, flanked by two solemn men holding ropes like ceremonial reins. One carries a scroll, the other carries a tiny wooden gavel. You nearly choke on your turnip. "They're putting her on trial," someone whispers beside you, entirely unfazed. You blink. "A pig?" He nods. "Murder, I think." You step outside, curiosity overpowering common sense, and follow the procession as it marches through the village square. The sow snorts softly, her pink ears flicking at the flies. A small crowd gathers. A bench is pulled into place, a stool for the magistrate. Someone drapes a tattered black cloth over a chair. The defence. Welcome to one of medieval Europe's most peculiar legal customs, animal trials. As absurd as it sounds, these trials were real. Especially between the 13th and 18th centuries, towns across France, Italy and parts of the Holy Roman Empire held fully formal trials for animals, complete with judges, lawyers, witnesses, even executions. Pigs were the most frequent offenders, typically accused of killing children. Dogs, cows, goats, and even insects occasionally faced justice too. And the punishment? Often the same as for humans: hanging, burning, or exile. The crowd settles. The bailiff clears his throat. The sow stands accused of biting the ear and face of infant Thomas, son of Ethel the Weaver, he announces. The child perished within the fortnight. There's a collective gasp, though half the crowd probably heard this 2 days ago. The pig is tied to a post. She snuffles at a beetle on the ground. Witnesses are called. Ethel appears first, her voice trembling with grief and fury. "I laid the babe in the shade," she says, and went to fetch water. When I returned, the sow had breached the fence, blood on her snout. The defence, a jittery young man in a robe 2 sizes too large, rises. Might another pig have been responsible? A murmur ripples through the crowd. Someone audibly scoffs. Another witness, the village swineherd, confirms the accused was known to be aggressive. "Bit my boot last week," he mutters, unprovoked. You expect the whole thing to devolve into farce, but the mood is dead serious. There's a formality to it, a procedure. This isn't just spectacle, it's a performance of order, of moral balance. Because here's the thing, in a time when human life was fragile and justice often uncertain, these trials weren't really about the animal. They were about community reassurance. A child has died. That's terrifying. But if something, anything, can be blamed, tried, punished and condemned, then the scales of the world feel a little more even. You watch as the magistrate leans forward, peers at the sow with what might be theatrical sorrow, and delivers the verdict. Guilty. Execution by hanging at dawn. The crowd nods solemnly. Some cross themselves. One boy sobs into his father's coat. And the pig? She blinks, uninterested. You step back, shaken not by the sentence but by how normal it all feels, as if this were just another Wednesday. You suppose in this village it is. You return to the square at dawn, half expecting to find that the villagers came to their senses overnight. That maybe someone remembered this is a pig, not a premeditating killer. That maybe justice slept in. But no, justice is already wide awake. The gallows has been rigged with an extra thick rope. A stool has been placed for the executioner, who looks decidedly uncomfortable. And the sow, now looking rather sleepy and utterly unaware, is tied to a post beside a stack of onions. A friar mutters a few words of blessing, or perhaps apology. The crowd is small this time, just a handful of adults, the magistrate, and a chicken that seems to have wandered into the moment by accident. You stand quietly at the back, trying to process it all. One of the older men beside you leans in and says, "It's not for the pig, you know." You nod. You do know. The trial wasn't really for her. It was for the people who'd lost something and needed to feel that something was paying a price. He continues. Some towns bury 'em with a sign. Others leave 'em in the woods, but always with ceremony. A death must be answered, or it lingers. He taps his chest once gently. Here. And historically, he's not wrong. Animal trials, as strange as they sound now, were grounded in medieval logic. The church taught that all creatures existed within a divine hierarchy, and if an animal disrupted that order, especially by taking a human life, it was seen not just as a crime, but a breach in the cosmic balance. The trial reasserted that balance. Sometimes the accused was exonerated. In one case in 1457, a sow was sentenced to death, but her 6 piglets were pardoned because they were found too young to have shared in the crime. Another time, a swarm of locusts was tried in absentia. The verdict? Excommunication and relocation. You watch as the rope is looped, the stool kicked away. The sow jerks once, then is still. No one cheers, no one claps. It's not a spectacle, it's a ritual, a grief, a message to the village. The wrong has been acknowledged. Now, move forward. But you can't help but feel the weight of it. Not the pig's death, but the fear behind it. The need to control a world so wild, so unforgiving, that even the animals must follow human law. A world where chaos could strike at any moment, and the only defence was to impose order, even over beasts. Later that afternoon, the village children play near the gallows, blissfully unbothered. One tucks a flower into the now empty rope. Another pretends to be a judge, squealing like a pig and making proclamations with a wooden spoon. And you realise something strange. The trial, the sentence, the execution. It wasn't about cruelty. It was about coping, about building a story where someone is to blame and that someone faces consequences, even if it's a pig. You wander back to the tavern with the quiet sense that, in the medieval world, justice wasn't always rational, but it was reassuring, and sometimes that was enough. You're standing in a small, slanted barbershop that smells like boiled leather, stale beer, and something vaguely minty. It's early morning, and you're hoping for a quick trim before heading to the next town. But the barber isn't ready. He's tuning a lute. You stare. He plucks a few strings, clears his throat, and belts out a note so shrill it makes a nearby cat leap from a windowsill. You glance around the room. A razor lies gleaming on the washstand. A bowl of warm water steams beside it. A chair, worn smooth by generations of nervous bottoms, sits waiting. But he won't lift the blade until he's finished his song. "Sorry," he says between verses. "I can't shave you until I hit the chorus." You consider leaving. Then the woman in the corner, threading herbs into little bundles, leans over and explains, "Silent barbers used to be assassins." You sit back down. Turns out, in some medieval towns, especially those prone to political drama or factional strife, barbers were required to sing, hum, or talk aloud while shaving. It was a rule, not just custom, and it had one job: make sure no one got stabbed in silence. Because here's the thing, barbers weren't just barbers. They were also surgeons, tooth pullers, bloodletters, wart burners, and, if you were unlucky, a convenient cover for a hired killer. A razor to the throat could be a shave or a statement. By enforcing noise, singing, reciting prayers, reciting saints' feast days, the townsfolk believed they could prevent betrayal. If your barber stopped mid-song, something was wrong. The rule likely originated after a few too many incidents where enemies accidentally bled out during their beard trim. In some Italian city-states, entire guilds adopted the policy. In others, it was posted publicly. Let the barber's blade never fall in silence. And even if your barber wasn't an assassin, silence was still suspicious. A quiet room with a knife in it? Not comforting. So you sit, trying not to flinch as the man transitions into a folksy ballad about a goose with marital problems. The razor scrapes across your jaw in long, practiced sweeps. His hand is steady, his voice less so. You get the distinct impression the singing isn't meant to entertain. It's meant to reassure. Him and you both. He pauses only once, when someone outside yells about a pig cart tipping over, and the sudden silence in the room is thunderous. Everyone freezes. Then he coughs and launches back into verse like his life depends on it. Maybe it does. You realise now why the barbershop window is always open, why the walls are thin, why the chair faces the door. It's not just good business, it's defence. In this world, the razor is intimate, dangerous, political. A haircut isn't just a service, it's a test of trust. By the time the shave is done, your cheeks are smooth, your nerves are shredded, and the barber is hoarse. He pats your face dry and offers a mint. You accept. And when you leave, you hum a little yourself, just in case anyone's listening. You return to the tavern later that evening, still rubbing your freshly shaven chin, when the blacksmith greets you with a knowing grin. "Ah," he says, "I see old Bartolomeo didn't slit your throat. Must have been a good tune." You raise an eyebrow. "He sang about a goose getting divorced." The blacksmith laughs. "Even better. That one's a favourite during tax season." You sit beside him by the hearth and sip something suspiciously herbal. It tastes like fermented sage and regret. Around you, the tavern buzzes with soft laughter, lute strings, and the clatter of cutlery. No razors, no threats, just warmth. And yet, the memory of that blade still lingers. You think back to the rules, how they begin as precautions then harden into tradition, how a barber humming tunelessly through a shave can be both a comfort and a coded signal. I mean no harm. I am not an agent of vengeance. And the deeper truth? In medieval society, violence often wore a very civil face. Barbers were positioned uniquely. They were close to the jugular, close to secrets, trusted with appearance, and thus with dignity. And in a world where betrayal often came by blade, singing became a kind of self-preservation. You hear more stories as the night wears on. One old woman swears a barber once confessed to a priest mid-shave and was absolved by the time the client's beard was done. A younger man says his uncle's barber used to sing psalms backward for protection. Supposedly cursed one noble into 7 years of marital impotence. Someone else claims the best barbers learned opera just to keep clients lulled. And one apprentice was fired for having a voice like a duck choking on soot, because bad singing made people nervous, and nervous people reach for their own knives. By candlelight, these tales feel half real, half shadow. But the fear they're built on, that's real. In an era where justice was often personal and feuds lasted generations, a man with a sharp blade and a steady hand held power. Singing wasn't just to prove his intentions, it was to fill the silence where suspicion might grow. And the rule stuck. Even today, in some corners of Europe, old barbers hum while they work. Not because they must, but because their grandfathers did. Because tradition whispers louder than logic. As the tavern dims and sleep tugs at your eyelids, you picture tomorrow's shave in a town without singing barbers. The sound of silence. The razor raised. And you know deep down, you'll take the Gustavus ballad any day. Because in the strange and sensible world of medieval rules, a bad song is better than a quiet cut. It's late evening when you decide to go for a walk. The air is cool and thick with chimney smoke, and the moon casts long silver streaks across the cobbled road. Most villagers have retreated indoors by now, their doors bolted, their shutters latched tight. You don't think much of it, until you round a corner and come face to face with a woman holding a lantern. She freezes. You freeze. Then, from somewhere down the lane, a whistle pierces the night. Within seconds, a man in a tattered uniform, part watchman, part scarecrow, appears and snatches the lantern from her hand. "No bell, no badge," he growls. "You'll come with me." The woman stammers, insisting she's just heading home from the bakehouse, that she didn't mean any harm. But it's too late. 2 more lantern bearers emerge from the shadows, official ones, with brass tokens hanging from their belts, and usher her away. You stand there, stunned. Later, back at the inn, the innkeeper explains with an exhausted sigh, "Unescorted women carrying lanterns at night, that's a crime, unless she's licensed, or married to someone who is." You blink. Licensed? To carry light? He nods. Town ordinance. Been that way since the fire and the scandal. Scandal? You press for details. Years ago, no one seems to agree exactly when, a woman was found wandering the town after dark, lantern in hand, stopping at windows. Some said she was searching for her lover. Others said she was casing homes for thieves. Still others claimed she was a spy, or worse, a witch. No one ever proved anything. But the fallout was enough. The town council, made up almost entirely of anxious men with long memories and short patience, passed a new rule. Any woman seen alone with a lit lantern after the ringing of the curfew bell shall be subject to arrest, unless she bears the town's badge or is in the company of a male guardian. You ask if that includes widows. "Especially widows," the innkeeper says grimly. You sit back, stunned. In a time when darkness was the enemy, of safety, of property, of order, light became its own kind of weapon. To wield it without approval was to claim a freedom not granted lightly. But there's more. In many medieval towns, prostitutes were legally required to carry lanterns after dark. The intention, supposedly, was safety and visibility, so they wouldn't be mistaken for honest women. But the result was social branding. A woman with a lantern was watched, judged, feared. That legacy clings to this village like smoke. So instead of empowering, the glow of a handheld flame marked you. It said, "She walks where she shouldn't," and people noticed. Always. The next morning, the incident still gnaws at you, so you visit the town scribe, a pale man with permanently ink-stained fingertips and a memory like a lockbox. His office smells like wax, mildew, and quiet frustration. You ask him about the lantern rule. He sighs, rifling through a wooden drawer until he finds a yellowed parchment. "Here," he says, tapping a brittle edge. "Civic Ordinance 142, ratified during the Frost riots, repealed briefly, then reinstated after the chimney arson incident." You squint, the text is barely legible, but the phrasing is unmistakable. No female person shall carry a flame unaided past the toll of curfew, save she be marked with town blessing or male escort, on pain of detention and public reprimand. Public reprimand, you ask? He grimaces. Lantern confiscated. Fined. Name read aloud after Mass. sometimes more, depending on her reputation. You sit back, suddenly cold. The rule isn't just about safety, it's about control, about visibility. A woman walking alone at night, guiding her own path, quite literally lit from within, was a threat to the kind of order the town wanted to protect. And in that light, she became a symbol. You learn more over the course of the day. A candle maker confesses that women often paid him in secret for smaller lanterns, ones easy to hide under cloaks. A baker's wife tells you her sister got caught once and was forced to sweep the churchyard barefoot for a week. Better that than what happened to Marjorie, she adds quietly and doesn't explain. One retired night watchman, old enough to look like part of the furniture, claims the rule was never about morality. It was about taxation. If you walked with a lantern, you weren't spending time at home, you weren't under your husband's roof, and that made the council uneasy. Lanterns meant liberty. He takes a sip of cider. Can't tax what you can't track. In some ways, he's right. Control of public space was often tied to light. Who lit the streets? Who could carry flame? Who was allowed to see and be seen? Light was a form of surveillance. To illuminate was to lay claim, and women, especially women alone, weren't meant to claim space without permission. That evening, as the sun begins to dip and the bell tolls its slow, smoky notes, you notice how quickly the lanterns disappear. Women walk faster, heads down. A few clutch unlit candles, waiting for husbands or brothers to fetch them. But not all. Near the edge of town, a girl, barely more than 15, strikes a flint. Her lantern catches. She walks, not hurried, but steady. No badge, no escort, just flame. You watch. No one stops her. Not tonight. And you wonder, how many other nights like this passed? How many women quietly defied the rule, slipping through alleys and over rooftops, lighting their way where no one expected them to walk? You smile, just a little, because in this village, the lantern isn't just light, it's resistance. It's just after midday when you catch a whiff of something rich and malty drifting through the back alleys of the village. You follow it instinctively, past a pen of sleepy goats, around a mossy well, and through a narrow stone archway, until you find it. A small, timber-framed building with black curtains in the window and a faded sign swinging in the breeze. On it, a single word, alewife. You step inside and are greeted by the clink of mugs, the scratch of lute strings, and a low murmur of laughter that sounds older than the beams above your head. The woman behind the counter, mid-40s, wiry, and wearing an apron soaked in something sticky, nods at you once and slaps a wooden mug onto the counter. "How special," she says, sliding it toward you. "First one's on the Saint." It's strong, spiced, slightly sour, and definitely brewed here. This is no ordinary tavern. You've entered the domain of one of medieval society's most vital and strangely regulated roles, the widow brewer. Turns out, in many towns during the Middle Ages, only widows were legally allowed to operate alehouses without a male guardian or official guild approval, and it wasn't just a social courtesy, it was policy. You ask her about it. She shrugs. "When my husband died, the council sent a boy with two things, a condolence loaf and a brewing licence. The arrangement was practical. Widows, often left with no source of income and mouths to feed, were granted the right to brew and sell ale from their homes. It gave them financial independence and gave the town beer. A fair trade. But it wasn't charity. It was necessity. Ale was safer to drink than water. It was calorie-dense, mildly alcoholic, and consumed at every meal. Children drank it. Monks drank it. Nobles drank it, though they preferred wine, and someone had to make it. So the town gave that job to those who were considered safe, socially invisible but industrious. Widows. The woman wipes her hands and gestures toward the corner, where a stack of sealed barrels sits beside a wall painted with strange markings. Tally marks, recipe notes, and what appears to be a crude drawing of a donkey in a bishop's hat. "Don't ask," she says. You sip your ale and take in the room. It's lively, but not rowdy. A soft sort of place. No yelling. No brawling. just people escaping the day's demands for a moment of comfort and yeast. Above the hearth hangs a polished ladle tied with black ribbon. You ask about it. Sign of mourning, she says, and of business. The ribbon tells the town she's a widow. The ladle tells them she serves ale. Together they say, this place is legal, blessed, and entirely her own. It's remarkable. In a world where women often had little agency, here is a space run entirely by one. No master, no guild, no permission slip. But, she adds, there are rules. Every widow brewer must measure her pints fairly. She must price her ale according to the grain tax. She must not water it down, or the ale taster, yes, that's a real job, will fine her. Or worse. She leans close. They say one woman in the next town over tried to stretch her malt with boiled nettles, sold it to a bishop, spent 3 days in the stocks with barley sacks tied to her ankles. You're not sure if she's joking, but you drink the rest of your mug a little more carefully. You linger in the alehouse longer than planned, lulled by the warmth of the hearth and the subtle pull of a second mug. The widow behind the counter, her name's Ellen as you finally learn, works with the precision of a blacksmith and the memory of a bard. She knows everyone's usual drink, knows who owes 2 pennies from last week, knows whose husband's been sampling ale down the road, and most importantly she knows when to shut up and when to pour. This isn't just her home, it's a micro-kingdom, and she's queen of the casks. But her position, for all its autonomy, isn't untouchable. There's always someone who doesn't like a woman with coin and customers, she says, elbow deep in mash, especially if they've got a dry throat and a jealous wife. She tells you about the ale conners, official ale inspectors appointed by the town, men who'd stride into taverns, sample ale, inspect measures, and sniff for dishonesty. Sometimes they were fair. Other times they'd fine women for the texture of their foam or claim the beer was too strong, even if it wasn't. Too strong for them, maybe, Ellen mutters. And then there's the church. Though ale was essential to village life, taverns often drew side-eye from moral authorities. Drinking could lead to gambling, swearing, and inappropriate mixing of the sexes. Widows who ran alehouses had to walk a tightrope, pious enough to avoid gossip, but lively enough to keep business alive. You ask if Ellen ever considered remarrying just to make things easier. She snorts. Remarry and give up this? A man would walk in here and move the spoons, and next thing I know he's naming the ale after himself. No thanks. I already buried one husband. That's plenty. Fair point. She's not the only one. All across medieval Europe, widowhood granted a peculiar kind of freedom. Unlike maidens, wives, or daughters, widows often had legal standing. They could sign contracts, own property, brew ale, but only if they didn't rock the boat too much. Ellen tells you about her friend, Alice, who dared to hire a young unmarried man to help with brewing. He was strong, quiet, a war orphan. But the town didn't like the look of it. Rumours flew, sales dropped. The church leaned in. Alice had to let him go. A few weeks later, her brewing licence was reconsidered. She moved. Ellen hasn't heard from her since. The hearth crackles behind you. You realise that every pint poured in this place is balanced on centuries of unspoken rules about gender, grief, respectability, and fermented grain. Still, Ellen endures. She keeps the ledger tidy, pays her tax in advance, sends the best casks to the harvest feast, offers 1 free mug to the local priest on feast days, and she never lets her ale go flat. Before you leave, she tops off your mug and hands you a wax twist of something crumbly and sweet. Barley biscuit, she says, keeps the head clear. You thank her. And as you step back into the fading afternoon light, you glance once more at the swinging sign above the door. Alewife. A badge of grief, perhaps, but also one of quiet power. It's late afternoon when the manor bell rings and the villagers begin streaming toward the great hall. You follow, curious, ducking beneath stone arches and past fluttering banners, until you find yourself swept into a long timbered room, filled with the scent of roasted meat and polished wood. You're just in time for the feast, a rare public meal where peasants are invited to dine alongside the manor lord and his retinue. Well, not alongside exactly, more like nearby, A steward gestures you toward a long, low trestle table near the far end of the hall. You sit beside a thatcher and a flax spinner, both already picking nervously at cold pottage. A roast goose glistens under candlelight at the centre table, flanked by trenchers piled high with bread and beef. Jugs of ale are passed. Laughter rises, but no one at your table touches a bite. Not until the nobleman takes the first mouthful. The moment is tense, awkward even. Spoons hover, hands fidget. Everyone watches the top table like children awaiting permission. Then, at last, Lord Everwyn, large, loud, and already red-cheeked from wine, lifts a spoonful of stewed leeks, tastes it, nods approvingly, and claps. Only then does the entire room begin to eat. You turn to the man beside you. Why wait? He glances sideways. Custom and survival. Turns out, in many feudal households, eating before the nobleman wasn't just rude, it was a dangerous breach of etiquette. At best, it was seen as disrespectful. At worst, a signal of rebellion, or worse yet, treason. Food moves upward, man whispers. Grain to the mill, flour to the manor, roast to the master. That's the order of things. Eat before the master eats, and it's like stealing from his mouth. You're struck by how literal this is. Power here is edible, tangible, a matter of sequence and ceremony. In some noble households, even the order of chewing was observed. Servants might hold food in their mouths until their lord swallowed. A delay of just seconds, but it reinforced the hierarchy. And it wasn't just about status. There was also the matter of poison. By tradition, the lord was served first so that everyone could see him eat and live. If he fell over foaming at the mouth, well, at least the pottage wouldn't go to waste. Some households took this so seriously they employed official tasters, men who sampled every dish before it reached their lord's lips. These tasters, often trusted servants or expendable relations, lived precarious lives and rarely dined with peace of mind. In smaller villages, though, the lord simply ate first, and everyone else waited to see if he keeled over. It was macabre, but practical. You glance back at Lord Everwyn. He's alive, and burping. The meal continues, and yet, even as plates are passed and trencher bread is dipped into thick oily stews, the hierarchy remains visible. Servants refill the nobles' cups before their own. The best cuts go to the top table. The meat at your table has more bone than flesh. The woman across from you tears a drumstick with her teeth and mutters, "He eats first, but we clean the bones." You smile at the honesty, because here, the rule isn't just about manners, it's about reminding everyone exactly where they stand. As the feast winds down, the nobles recline in their high-back chairs, dabbing their mouths with linen while the rest of the hall picks meat from gristle and sops up gravy with the last of the trenchers. You notice the steward watching the tables closely, noting who eats too quickly, who reaches too far, who forgets to bow when addressed. Nothing goes unnoticed. After dessert, which for you is a lump of spiced barley pudding wrapped in what might be old cabbage, the lords and ladies rise and leave the hall. The moment they do, the energy shifts. Voices grow louder. Ale flows a little freer. A boy tosses a chicken bone at a friend. Someone starts humming a tune. But no one touches the high table. It sits untouched now, half covered in crumbs and silverware like a sacred ruin. You mention this to the flax spinner beside you. He nods. "Table's not for us," he says. "Even when empty, it's not ours." In many medieval households, the lord's table wasn't just furniture, it was symbol. To sit at it uninvited, or to serve oneself from it, was an act of presumption bordering on rebellion. In some manors, it was considered such a breach of decorum that it could cost you your tenancy. And yet, despite the rigid rules, there's an odd kind of warmth in the room now. Someone brings out a pipe. A girl begins braiding onions into a long chain while singing softly. The community is no less hungry for joy than it was for food. Still, the rules echo long after the last bite. You learn of one local tale, a boy who once dared to sneak a goose leg from the noble's platter before the blessing. He was caught and made to carry a sack of spoiled oats through the village, while wearing a tunic inside out and backwards. For a week, the children called him Goose Lord, and while no one seems to remember his real name, everyone remembers the rule: eat after your betters, because the act of eating was never just about hunger, it was layered with meaning, about deference, loyalty, patience. A full belly was a gift, not a right. Even in rare moments of shared abundance like this, order was maintained one bite at a time. As the fire dims and the scraps are cleared, you notice one last ritual. The steward takes a single crust from the high table and places it gently into a basket. Later, you find out, those leftovers will be given to the poorest widow in the village, only after being blessed by the priest and acknowledged by the Lord. Even charity has a chain of command. You step outside into the cool night and watch the villagers scatter home, quieter now, satisfied, but subdued. The nobleman ate first. The order was preserved. No lines crossed, no boundaries blurred. And in this world, that's what matters most, because eating before your master might feed your stomach, but it could starve your future. It's early morning when the blacksmith's apprentice arrives at your door holding something strange in a strip of cloth. A long curl of coarse, dark hair. From the trial, he says with a grin, as if that explains everything. Before you can ask more, he's gone. You unwrap it, baffled. The hair is freshly cut, still damp with sweat, and tied to the cloth is a scrap of parchment with a name, not your own. By the time you finish breakfast, the town crier is already walking the square, bell in one hand, scroll in the other. Let it be known, he declares, that one Agnes Miller shall answer for her crimes at the midday tribunal. Her braid, offered as evidence, shall be entered into the record. You pause. Her braid? The answer, you'll soon learn, lies in one of the stranger legal practices in medieval Europe: hair used as evidence. In a world without photography, fingerprints or surveillance, justice relied on what could be seen, touched or held, and hair, long, distinct and often intimately associated with personal identity, became both symbol and proof. You follow the crowd to the courthouse, which smells like oiled wood and dried sweat. The judge arrives wearing robes so heavy they seem better suited to winter. Agnes stands at the front, flanked by two town elders. She doesn't look afraid, just irritated. A clerk reads the charge, that Agnes did knowingly and with intent hex her neighbour's butter churn, rendering it soured for 3 consecutive days. You blink. This is about butter? The prosecution presents the braid, the one you received. Cut from her at sunrise, he announces, with a silver blade blessed in smoke, as per tradition. A murmur of approval passes through the crowd. Turns out hair was believed to carry magic, especially women's hair. It could be used in love spells, protection charms, or in this case as damning proof of witchcraft. But it wasn't always about sorcery. In many towns, hair was offered in disputes as a physical token, a stand-in for something larger, a promise, a claim, a sacrifice. If a person cut their own braid and submitted it to the court, it meant, I submit to judgment. In cases involving accusations of theft, slander or assault, the hair of the accused might be handed over to officials while the investigation proceeded. It was tangible, portable, and deeply symbolic. Agnes, meanwhile, scoffs at the accusation. If I had such power, she says, my own goat wouldn't be barren. The court chuckles. Even the judge hides a smile. Still, the ritual proceeds. The judge examines the braid, declares it reasonably coarse and credible, and then gestures to the neighbour's butter. A bowl is produced. The judge tastes it, winces, nods gravely. Agnes is fined a halfpenny and ordered to sweep the North Chapel stairs for a week. The braid is tied to the courthouse wall beside a dozen others, hair of those who've stood judgment in years past. Some thick, some wispy, one even white as snow. A row of forgotten consequences fluttering faintly in the wind. You leave the courthouse with a strange sense of awe. In this world, a lock of hair can hold more weight than a witness, and in a land where truth is slippery and memory shorter than harvest, sometimes the only way to be seen is to be shorn. That evening you return to the square, where the breeze has picked up and the row of hanging braids now flutters like a strange, sombre banner, a tapestry of past infractions swaying over the heads of gossiping villagers and clucking hens. You spot Agnes again, broom in hand, sweeping the chapel steps with theatrical sighs. Someone offers her a turnip, she throws it at them. You sit nearby, still thinking about how a braid could become legal tender. It's not just strange, it's intimate. A piece of someone, severed and submitted for judgment. The village clerk wanders past and notices your gaze. Hair holds memory, he says, as if continuing a conversation you hadn't started. Or so they say. He explains that in many medieval beliefs, hair wasn't just part of the body, it was part of the soul. That's why monks shaved theirs in symbolic humility. That's why widows cut their hair short in mourning. And that's why traitors and criminals often had their heads shaved in public, to mark their shame and strip them of dignity. You cut someone's hair, the clerk says. You cut their story. You ask if people ever refused. Oh, of course, he says. But refusal often was seen as guilt. What have you got to hide under that braid? You remember something the flax spinner told you earlier in the week, that when she was accused of stealing wool, she offered a braid of her daughter's hair instead. The court accepted it. You were shocked. Better to sacrifice pride than prove innocence with your fists, she'd said. Back at the chapel, Agnes finishes her sweeping, and a small girl brings her a cup of barley tea. Agnes ruffles her hair, lightly, almost reverently, and for a moment you see it. This strange currency of hair, reputation, and ritual isn't about vanity at all. It's about visibility, about being known. In a time where written records were rare and truth lived by rumour, a lock of hair was a physical history, one you couldn't fake, one that could hang on a wall long after memory faded. There are tales, the clerk adds, of braids being returned years later, when a woman was proven innocent, or when her accuser died. Some were even buried with their owners, tucked into coffins as a sign that their honour had been restored. Others were burned during festivals, alongside herbs and old debts, as a symbol of cleansing. But always the act was ceremonial. Hair had weight, and you begin to see the rule differently. Yes, it's strange, but it speaks to a need deeper than justice, the need to be acknowledged, to have your wrongdoing, or your lack of wrongdoing, recorded in something more lasting than gossip. As the sun sets and the chapel bell tolls, Agnes hands the broom to a boy and walks past you, chin high, eyes sharp. Her hair is noticeably shorter now, but she carries herself like someone who gave up only what she could afford. Not penance, just a strand. It's a rainy Thursday when you find yourself ducking into the side door of the village weaver's hall to avoid a particularly enthusiastic goose. Inside it's warm, cluttered, and alive with the clatter of looms and the soft drone of women humming at their work. Coloured threads criss-cross the room like spider silk. The air smells of damp wool, hot oil, and, oddly, onion. You sit quietly on a bench, watching as the older women spin, the younger ones die, and the middle-aged ones scold everyone equally. It's a comforting rhythm, until someone laughs. Not a giggle, not a smirk, a full-bodied, wheezing, eye-watering cackle from a girl no older than 16. The room stops. Utter silence. The loom closest to her screeches to a halt. An older woman with a pinched mouth and flawless posture turns slowly in her chair and says, "Do you mind? It's Ember Week." The girl mutters an apology and returns to her work, face flushed. You lean over to your neighbour and whisper, "What just happened?" She doesn't look up. "It's Ember Week," she says. No laughing aloud. You wait for her to clarify. She doesn't. So begins your initiation into one of the more sobering customs of medieval village life. Laughter bans during periods of religious austerity. While Lent was the most widely recognised season of restraint, many towns had their own local observances, fasting weeks, mourning days, saintly anniversaries, during which merriment of any kind was strictly forbidden, and not just in church, in life. In this village the rule is simple. During Ember Days, no music, no dancing, and above all no laughter. You ask why. The woman beside you shrugs. because the angels are listening, and joy offends them when the Lord is grieving. It's hard to argue with that level of theological certainty. Historically, Ember Days were quarterly periods of prayer and fasting in the Christian calendar, meant to sanctify the seasons and offer thanks for nature's bounty. But over time, their observance blurred with local superstition. In some places, they were seen as days when the veil between worlds grew thin, when too much mirth could attract attention from the wrong spirits, or worse, from judgmental neighbours. You learn that laughter during solemn days wasn't just rude, it was considered a social threat, a sign of disrespect, moral laxity, or even possession. In one story, an apprentice blacksmith in a nearby town let out a snort during a funeral procession. The priest declared him touched by levity, and he was forced to wear a gag made of broom bristles for 3 days. He never smiled again, not because he was punished, because no one would talk to him after. In small, tightly knit communities, conformity was survival. If everyone was mourning, you mourned. If everyone was silent, you silenced yourself. Joy had a time and place, and this was not it. And so, on Ember Days, people learn to hold their tongues and their laughter. As you leave the weaver's hall, you see the girl from earlier walking home with her head down. A boy beside her murmurs something, and she covers her mouth quickly, eyes darting around. Not because she's afraid of being cursed, but because laughter just now could cost her a job, or a reputation, or something harder to fix, like belonging. That night at the tavern, the difference is stark. No singing, no lute, no clinking mugs raised in toasts or belly laughs over spilled stew. Just the occasional whispered conversation, the quiet scrape of spoons on wooden bowls, and the low, almost reverent crackle of the hearth fire. Even the drunkard in the corner, the one who usually tries to recite poetry after 2 cups, sits still, nursing his drink with unusual dignity. You ask Ellen, the widow brewer, if it's always this quiet during Ember Days. She nods, polishing mugs in silence, then adds in a whisper, "One year someone tried to play the fife. We didn't see him for a week. Said he had to go on a repentance walk to the old chapel 3 towns over, with no shoes." You can't tell if she's serious, but the unease is real. It hangs in the air like smoke. It's not that the people don't know how to laugh, it's that they've trained themselves to withhold joy, to delay it, to bottle it up and store it like winter ale, reserved for the right season. And in this season, laughter is taboo. You learn that some villages kept joy logs during periods of austerity, parchment records where notable jokes, stories, and humorous events were written down in silence, to be read aloud later when merriment was permitted again. It sounds absurd. But in a world of famine, plague, and divine wrath, joy wasn't taken lightly. Joy was sacred, and sacred things required rules. One of the tavern's regulars, an old man with eyebrows like frostbitten hay, leans toward you and says, "The soul has 4 chambers, one for sorrow, one for hunger, one for prayer, and one for laughter, but never open all 4 at once, or you'll burst." You smile before you remember the rule. Then you swallow the smile. It's a strange thing, this communal suppression. You feel it in your body, a tension, a clenching, a sense that even thinking something funny is a kind of rebellion. You want to ask, who does it hurt if someone laughs during Ember Week? But then you realise that's the wrong question. The real question is, who feels safe if no one does? In a world where grief had to be acknowledged communally, where bad harvests were blamed on sin and disasters were interpreted as moral failings, controlling emotion became a form of risk management. If the town is fasting, you fast. If the town is weeping, you weep. And if you don't, well, who's to say that storm tomorrow wasn't your fault? By the end of the night, the silence feels normal, natural even. You catch yourself holding back a chuckle when the dog under the table steals someone's bread. No one reacts, not even a smirk. You step out into the night air, stars wheeling above, and realise something profound. Laughter is a kind of currency here, valuable, rare, and like all valuable things, it has its own season. But when that season comes, You suspect this little village will burst with it, like a log fire long overdue. The rooster crows, but no one stirs. Not because the town is lazy, quite the opposite. But today is no ordinary day. It's bathing Sunday. And if you think that means the village is about to get squeaky clean, you'd be only half right. You crack open the shutters of your rented room and see it. A queue already forming near the town's communal bathhouse. Women with buckets, boys with chipped soap cakes. A man clutching a suspiciously wilted bundle of lavender like it's a magical talisman. At first it seems oddly cheerful, until a cart rolls up with 3 massive barrels of boiled nettle water, and the mood shifts to something more ceremonial. You get dressed and join the stream of bodies headed toward the low stone bathhouse, where steam curls out from the door like dragon's breath, and a wooden sign reads, "No bathing outside appointed days. Offenders fined 2 eggs and a strip of cloth." That's right. Bathing was often restricted. In many medieval towns, public bathhouses operated only on designated days, usually Sundays or St. Feast days. Why? Well, partly to conserve firewood and hot water, but also to monitor modesty and morality. You overhear a woman grumble. Last week the brewer's son tried to sneak a wash on Wednesday, said he smelled like destiny, got whipped with a birch broom instead. Inside, the bathhouse is cavernous, dim and humid. Steam rises like ghosts. Stone tubs line the walls. There are separate hours for men and women, and right now it's the men's turn, which means the air is thick with damp wool, damp skin, and dampened pride. You strip to the waist and take your place in line for a rinsing. The man behind you holds a fish scale and says, "If it sticks to your arm, you need a wash." You laugh. He doesn't. For all the jokes about medieval people never bathing, the truth is more nuanced. Bathing was important, but communal, ritualized, and strictly regulated. Too much washing could be seen as vain or decadent, especially if done alone. Bathing in secret was suspicious. Why hide it, unless you had something to cleanse? In fact, in some areas, unauthorized bathing was punishable by law, especially if it occurred during prohibited hours or in mixed company. The bathhouse was a social space, not a private luxury. Your turn comes, and you step into the stone tub. The water is warm, slightly brown, and smells faintly of elderflower. Someone slaps a damp cloth into your hand and grunts. Don't dawdle. 3 scoops and pass it on. You scrub quickly, trying not to inhale too deeply. A boy passes carrying a slotted spoon. You don't ask why, and as you rinse you notice something strange. No one speaks. No laughter, no small talk. Just the sound of splashing water and the occasional cough. Bathing here isn't a spa day. It's a penance, a duty, a public cleansing both literal and symbolic. You learn that on Bathing Sunday, being seen bathing was part of the point. It wasn't just about dirt. It was about proving you were part of the community, clean enough to belong, clean enough to be trusted. And if you skipped it, well, people noticed. After the rinse, you step out dripping and humbled. A hunched old man hands you a scratchy towel and gestures to the drying room, which is really just a cold alcove with slatted windows and no fire. It's here you discover the second half of Bathing Sunday's charm, the inspection. An official-looking woman with ink-stained fingers stands near the exit, holding a ledger bound in pigskin. One by one, bathers shuffle past her, giving their names. She marks them down without speaking. You ask someone nearby what this is about. That's Maud. She keeps the clean book, a man whispers, so if you die next week, no one blames it on spiritual grime. You blink. He shrugs. If a man dies and hasn't bathed in 3 weeks, people talk, say the devil couldn't grip a clean soul. It sounds like superstition, but it's very real in practice. Bathing records weren't universal across medieval Europe, but in many communities, especially religious towns or plague-prone districts, there were informal cleansing logs to track who had participated in communal washing. It was a health precaution, a social inventory, and a quiet way of ensuring nobody strayed too far from communal norms. You step up. "Name?" Maud asks, not looking up. You give it. She raises one eyebrow. You bathed last week, didn't you? At Widow Ellen's? Your eyes widen. How does she... She scribbles something in the book and waves you along. Later, you learn Widow Ellen's was an illegal bathhouse, a private tub behind the brewery, used mostly by travelling merchants and men who didn't want their sins tallied in the clean book. You'd stumbled in during a barley washing mistake, and now you're on record. As you walk through town later, cleaner but not quite at ease, you start to see the rule's purpose. In an era of limited resources and chronic disease, shared water and coordinated hygiene weren't just practical, they were political. Everyone bathes together, on the same day, in the same space. And those who don't, they're noticed, watched, talked about. Because in a community where disease spread fast and trust was everything, being dirty wasn't just about mud or sweat. It was a moral category. Cleanliness signalled conformity, humility, participation in the rhythms of the town, and isolation smelled worse than any unwashed armpit. You pass a group of kids throwing old bathwater down a gutter and hear one say, "Don't waste it, that's blessed nettle juice." You can't tell if they're joking. But the mood in the village has shifted. With the rite complete, people are smiling again. Looser. The baker whistles. A dog gets soapy water flung at it and runs off howling. The tavern smells faintly of lavender and damp wool. And for the rest of the week, nobody will question your odour or your belonging. All thanks to one oddly rigid, deeply communal, unexpectedly practical medieval rule. Wash when told, and let the neighbours watch. It begins with a whisper and ends with a torch. You're walking through the village square one afternoon when you notice the blacksmith hammering in complete silence. Not just focused, silent. Even the children nearby are eerily quiet, playing with sticks as if afraid to let them clack too loudly. At first, you think someone's died, but then you spot the wooden post in the centre of the square, fresh straw at the base, a new iron chain bolted halfway up, and on the ground beside it, a bundle of twigs, herbs, and dried toadstools tied with red thread. A man leans close and murmurs, "Witch's window was open last night." You frown. What does that mean? He looks at you like you've never known fear. Means she was tempting the devil in. We'll need a noise cleansing. This is your first encounter with the quiet rule. In certain parts of medieval Europe, particularly in rural areas with strong folk traditions, it was believed that loud sounds could invite or activate evil. Thunder, cackling, shouting, any of these during suspicious times, e.g. seasonal transitions, eclipses, solstices, could unbalance the veil between worlds. But there was an opposite superstition too. Silence was protection. If someone in the village was suspected of witchcraft, unnatural luck, or causing illness, the community would sometimes impose a quieting, a day or more of enforced silence in that person's presence, especially during rituals of investigation or punishment. It wasn't just eerie, it was legal. In some towns, local customs, unwritten but rigidly enforced, dictated that no one could speak, laugh, or cry while passing a known witch's home during the appointed cleansing hours. It was believed that noise gave energy to the spirits and demons around her, and silence starved them. So here you are, in a village that believes a woman opened her shutters at the wrong hour, and now every man, woman and child is part of a protective hush. No greetings, no vendors hawking wares, just gestures and glances. And you? You're the outsider who doesn't know the rules. You nearly step into the baker's stall to ask for bread when a young boy throws a pebble at your boot and shakes his head violently, pressing one finger to his lips. You nod, stepping back, pulse racing. It feels ridiculous. And yet, there's something powerful about it. The unity, the tension, the fear. You learn that in cases like this, the silence continues until sunset, at which point a noise cleansing is performed. A bizarre ritual involving drums, clanging pots, shouting, singing, and, if needed, the burning of a symbolic effigy, or less symbolically, the accused herself. You shiver, but part of you gets it. In a world without science, rules like these gave shape to chaos. They let people believe they could control disease, disaster, even the devil himself, so long as they kept quiet when told. And heaven help you if you forgot. As the sun begins to sink behind the trees, the mood in the village shifts again, slowly at first, like a breeze turning into wind. A bell tolls once from the chapel tower. That's the signal. The silence ends, and just like that, the entire square erupts in chaos. Not panic, but planned pandemonium. Children shriek on purpose. Old women bang wooden spoons against copper pots. The blacksmith pounds his anvil in wild, irregular rhythms. Someone is blowing into a ram's horn. You're handed a ladle and told to clatter it like a curse is crawling up your boot. This is the noise cleansing. In theory, it's meant to drive out evil, to disrupt any lingering spirits or demonic influences stirred by the accused witch's actions. The louder and more chaotic, the better. In practice, it feels like a village-sized tantrum, or a party no one is quite enjoying. You spot the accused woman, a grey-haired widow named Edith, standing near the well. She's pale, jaw clenched, hands gripping her apron like it might hold her together. No one is hitting her. No one speaks to her. But they bang, sing, howl, and chant around her, creating a sound wall of judgment she can't break through. It's cruel. And yet, somehow, no one thinks they're doing anything wrong. You learn that this was once common custom. In parts of the British Isles, Germany and Scandinavia, rough music rituals, also known as charivari or skimmingtons, were used to punish perceived social deviants. Witches, adulterers, greedy millers, people who laughed at funerals. And though it wasn't law in the formal sense, violating these unwritten rules could get you banished, or worse. Edith doesn't speak. That would break the script. She just waits. When the ritual ends, after exactly 13 minutes, the village quiets. Someone throws a handful of dried sage at her feet. She walks home, alone, under a sky full of stars that no one points at. No one says a word. Because the real silence isn't what happens during the ritual. It's what happens after. You help clean up the square. Ashes, broken pots, scraps of cloth used for noise flags. One of the elders pats your shoulder. You were good. Didn't break the silence. You're learning. But you're not sure you want to. Because now you understand. The rule of silence isn't just about protection. It's about power. About who gets to speak. And when. About who controls the story. Who names the devil and who becomes him. And perhaps, in this strange little village, the most dangerous thing you can do is speak when you're not supposed to. Or worse, remain quiet when the world needs noise. The first thing you notice is the rope. It hangs from a wooden beam above the town's central granary, not for punishment, but for measuring bread. A baker stands beside it, carefully lowering a fresh loaf in a hemp sling. If it passes below a painted notch on the pole, he grunts and tosses it into the acceptable basket. If not, it goes into the fire. You blink. You're burning bread? He shrugs. Rather that than the stocks. Welcome to the strange world of the assize of bread and ale, a bizarrely specific set of medieval regulations that governed how bread and ale were made, sold and priced. And yes, there were ropes involved. But why? Well, bread in the Middle Ages wasn't just food, it was survival. The poor lived on it. Towns relied on it to prevent riots. One bad batch, or one greedy baker, could literally spark a revolt. So around the 13th century, England passed one of its oldest consumer protection laws, the assize of bread and ale. This wasn't a mere suggestion. It was law, setting exact weights and prices for bread depending on the market rate of wheat. Too light, too expensive, or made with filler like chalk or sawdust. That could land you in serious trouble. Some towns used loaf measuring ropes tied to official beams. Others used standardized wooden templates or test loaves. In one French village, loaves had to match the width of a priest's palm. In another, the bread inspector used a scale weighted with a dried turnip. Nobody remembers why. The turnip is long gone. Today, in this village, the rope is king. You follow the baker into his kitchen, where dough rises in woven baskets and hot stones line the oven floor. He explains the trick. You need air in, makes it rise without cheating. But if you add ash for weight, or grind in beans to stretch the flour. He trails off and gestures toward the charred bad batch pile. Someone always finds out. You ask what happens to those who don't follow the rules. He taps the side of his nose. Stocks, fines, or a shame march through the square, and sometimes... He lowers his voice. You're banned from baking for life. Imagine that. No more kneading, no more yeast, just watching other men feed the town. That's the real punishment. In a society where baking was power, being barred from it was social death. And yet, despite the risk, bakers sometimes cheated, added sand to stretch flour, skimped on yeast, hid small pebbles inside dense rye loaves to meet weight quotas. Anything to keep profit up when grain was scarce. But people noticed. They always noticed. Because bread, humble, rough, slightly burnt at the edges, wasn't just food. It was trust. And in this village, you measure trust with a rope. You linger near the granary as the bread inspectors arrive. 2 men in woolen robes and matching badges carved from horn. They carry a worn leather satchel and a curious tool that looks like a small balance scale welded to a ruler. The ritual is oddly formal. One inspector carefully places a test loaf onto the scale, while the other mutters grain prices from a sheet. Then they compare it to the slaw loaf, a preserved model of what a legal bread size should be that week. Not last week. Not next week. Just this one. The numbers, they say, shift with the wind, or more accurately with the market. That's part of the madness. The law changed constantly depending on the cost of wheat. If grain prices rose, bakers had to make smaller loaves for the same price. If prices dropped, loaves had to grow without raising cost. In essence, bakers were forced to gamble, predict too high a price, and your bread would be underweight. Too low, and you'd lose money. Guess wrong too often, and you'd be branded a cheater. You watch as one young apprentice brings out a basket of oat loaves, dark, nutty smelling, rough-edged. The inspector picks one up, sniffs it, and smashes it in half with the flat of his hand. Crumbs fly. He digs inside with 2 fingers and pulls out something white and flaky. Lime chalk, he mutters. The baker stammers, says it's just coarse salt, but it's too late. The inspector marks a red line across the bakery's door and calls over 2 boys with drums. Within minutes, a crowd has gathered to watch as the baker is marched through the square holding one of his bad loaves on a wooden paddle. The drum beats are slow, mocking. A woman throws an onion at his back. You glance at the baker you spoke to earlier. He crosses himself and whispers, "That's mercy. Could have been a day in the stocks with rats chewing your shoelaces." The punishment is public for a reason. It's a performance meant to restore trust in the system. Bread was too vital to mess with. In times of famine, riots often began in the bakery, so the laws were strict, the rituals elaborate, and the symbolism potent. But here's the twist. There's a reason the baker carries a bad loaf on the shame paddle, to prove to the town that he still knows the difference, that he's not just evil, he's fallen and ready to rise again. You think back to yesterday, when you saw the rope and laughed. It had seemed silly. Now it feels sacred. The rope, the scale, the paddle. They were tools of justice in flour and yeast, made to protect the poorest villagers from starvation and to remind every baker that they weren't just feeding mouths. They were feeding trust. And trust in medieval times was baked fresh each morning, then measured, inspected, and sometimes burned. It starts with a sneeze. Just one, innocent, itchy-nosed sneeze as you step into the town chapel, but the reaction is immediate. Heads turn. A woman gasps. An old man mutters something about unlucky winds. And then, someone rings a tiny bell. You're quickly ushered to the side and handed a herb-stuffed pouch to hold over your face. Not a punishment exactly, but definitely a signal. Welcome to the medieval rule of no unblessed breaths indoors. You had no idea something so invisible could cause such panic. But in the Middle Ages, breath was more than just air. It was considered a carrier of both blessings and blight. And your involuntary nasal explosion? That could have been enough to pollute sacred space or even cause illness, depending on who you asked. This belief wasn't plucked from thin air. Medieval people had a surprisingly complex understanding of contagion, though filtered through a religious and humoral lens. They believed bad air, known as miasma, carried disease and sin. A breath expelled during illness, grief, or even intense prayer could taint the space around you, especially in places where divine presence was believed to dwell. So rules were created, sometimes local, sometimes ecclesiastical, often just folklore passed down. You find out from a red-faced deacon that this village follows the silent breath ordinance, established after a devastating pox outbreak 2 decades ago. According to it, you must hold your breath when walking past an altar. You may not exhale near icons or relics unless you've confessed that morning. If you cough or sneeze during Mass, you must undergo a ritual cleansing. And if you're ill, you must wear a blessing veil, a light cloth infused with rosemary, sage and vinegar over your mouth and nose. The pouch they gave you is a makeshift veil stuffed with dried lavender and thistle. You try not to laugh, but part of you starts to understand. In a time when plague and pestilence could level entire towns, people were desperate to explain how illness moved. Germs weren't in their vocabulary, but bad breath, bad air, that made sense. It was felt, smelled, feared. And inside the chapel, with its musty air and flickering candles, the idea of a single cough starting a slow, invisible spiral toward death wasn't so far-fetched. The priest tells a story as he anoints the altar. A woman who sobbed during her husband's funeral, unleashing a breath so soaked in grief that it clung to the rafters and soured the consecrated air. The next day, 2 altar boys fell ill. Coincidence? Not to them. So now, breath is policed. You learn the hard way that even singing is regulated. During high holy days, only those who've fasted and been cleansed are allowed to join in the hymns. The rest must hum quietly into their sleeves, or not at all. It's suffocating, yet somehow sacred. A community binding itself together through shared restraint, through air denied. You step back outside and finally take a deep, full breath. And only then do you realize how much weight you were holding. The next morning you're still thinking about the air, about how something so invisible could carry so much meaning. And as you wander through the village, you start to notice more of these quiet rules. Traces of the breath taboo that have woven themselves into everyday life. The first place it strikes you is the bakery. You walk in, craving something warm, and you're immediately greeted by a strange sight. The baker is working with a scarf wrapped around his mouth, not to keep out flour, but for something more ceremonial. There's a loaf marked with a charcoal cross set aside on its own tray. You ask cautiously what it's for. Widow's bread, he says, mustn't breathe on it. It's meant for mourning. You realise the superstition stretches far beyond chapels. Bread for the dead, beer for the birthing, salt for the sick, all had breath rules. It wasn't just about contagion anymore, it was about spiritual vulnerability. Certain people, at certain moments, grieving, giving birth, dying, were seen as open portals, and your breath, if impure, could pass through them and do harm. You pass a midwife who's burning juniper twigs outside a cottage. She's muttering to herself, wafting smoke over the doorway. Can't let the newborn smell bad breath, she tells you. They remember the scent of heaven. We mustn't stain it. Even breathing over the threshold of a home could be considered an intrusion, especially if you were in a bad mood or hadn't bathed. In some villages it was law. No one could speak, cough or exhale across a doorstep until invited inside. You start to understand the deeper meaning. Breath, in their eyes, wasn't just air. It was intention, emotion, a part of your soul that left your body and mingled with others. And so, controlling breath became a kind of moral hygiene. At the local tavern, a man toasts with ale but makes a show of turning his face sideways before he exhales. Not out of manners, but habit. a protective charm passed down like a family recipe. There's even a tale told around the fire that night. A travelling monk who never spoke indoors. They say he held his breath in every sacred space for 20 years, and that when he finally died, his last exhale came out as perfumed smoke. A saint's breath, they called it. Bottled in a reliquary, kissed by pilgrims for generations. And perhaps the most surprising twist. These breath taboos didn't just spread across Europe, they travelled. Some made it into early Islamic hygiene customs, others into East Asian temple etiquette. And today, centuries later, you still see echoes, covering your mouth when you yawn, holding your breath during a tense moment, lighting incense in silence. They all whisper back to a time when air was sacred, and exhaling at the wrong time could mean dishonour, disease, or death. You walk home in the quiet, hand near your mouth, suddenly aware of every puff of vapour in the cool evening air, and for the first time you truly understand what it meant when they said, "Watch your breath, it might be watching you." You're woken by bells, not the sweet kind that toll the hour, but a grating clatter of metal on metal. When you stumble outside, still half asleep, you find half the village standing in the street, in socks, barefoot or stocking-footed, every last one of them. And you're the only one in boots. That earns you a few sideways glances and a muttered, "Newcomers never read the wall rules." A kind woman takes pity on you and gently explains, "Today is Silence Feet Day." Once a season, no one may wear hard soles inside the village walls, not because of religion or mourning, but because of the bees. You blink. The bees? Yes, and not just any bees. These are the Lord's bees, a protected swarm that nests inside the old church bell tower. According to village custom, they're sacred. It's said that they carry the souls of the departed to the afterlife, or at least help whisper their names to heaven. And every year, for 1 week, the bees descend. Quietly. All at once. They hum low. They search slowly. And if startled, they sting. So to keep them calm, the entire village muffles its steps. Horses are padded with wool. Shopkeepers lay down rushes. Children are forbidden to run. Even the blacksmith moves like a dancer, hammering only at dawn or dusk. The rule is older than memory, passed down from a time when the death of a hive meant famine, disease, or divine punishment. In fact, you're told that 1 year, long ago, a lord refused to obey the quiet soul law, and within a month his fields were cursed with mildew. You half laugh at the idea, but then glance up at the church tower and see the bees, dozens of them, calm, golden, purposeful. The town is unusually still today. You can feel it under your toes, the crunch of dirt softened by moss, the gentle hiss of wind over thatched roofs, and always the faint buzz of wings. And here's where it gets stranger. They don't just protect the bees for nature's sake, they talk to them. Later that afternoon, a young boy is buried just beyond the chapel wall. After the family finishes their prayers, an elder walks slowly to the hive and whispers the child's name. "So they'll know he's come," someone explains. This isn't just folklore, it's a real tradition, documented in many parts of medieval Europe, especially in the British Isles, where it was called telling the bees. When someone died, the bees had to be informed or they'd leave, or die of grief, and if they stayed, it meant the soul had passed safely. So today, the silence isn't just for the bees, it's for the dead. It's for reverence. It's for the fragile contract between man and nature, whispered through pollen and prayer. You feel yourself walking more softly now. Even your breath seems quieter. Because in this strange little village, it's not the stingers that are sacred, it's the stillness they demand. As the sun begins to sink behind the hill, you find yourself drawn toward the church tower, where the bees drift in and out like golden ghosts. Their hum isn't just a sound anymore. It's a rhythm, like the heartbeat of the village. You sit near a group of women weaving garlands. They don't speak above a whisper. One of them offers you a small braid of clover and mint to hang by your door. It keeps the bees friendly, she says, and invites them to listen. Wait, that's when she tells you about the bee oath. Once every few years, when a new head beekeeper is chosen, usually the oldest woman in the village, a ceremony is held under the new moon. The bees are sworn in as sacred creatures. Witnesses gather barefoot, and the oath is spoken not to the crowd but directly to the hive. I swear to protect you, not to steal from you, not to kill your kin with smoke or fire. May your wings be blessed, your queen long-lived, and your anger slow. It sounds absurd, but the reverence is real. You learn that in this place, and in many others like it during the medieval period. Bees weren't simply livestock. They were spiritual mediators, legal witnesses, even mourners. Some households were required by local custom to drape the hive in black cloth during funerals. Others would feed honey to the dying so they could taste sweetness one last time. And if a hive was ever mistreated, the consequences were dire. There are stories, half warning, half folklore, about villages struck by blight, crops withering, cows miscarrying, all because someone struck a hive or stole honey without asking. You might scoff, but think about it. In a world where honey was the only sweetener, bees were survival. They pollinated the herbs used in healing salves. They kept your bread from going stale. Their wax lit your chapel, and their buzzing was, to many, the sound of God at work. It makes sense, then, that entire laws developed around their care. In medieval Irish law, a swarm of bees could sue you. Well, not directly, but if they left your property because you wronged them and settled on someone else's land, you might lose ownership, unless you apologised. Through the bees. Stranger still, bees were considered impartial creatures, the ultimate witnesses. There are records of disputes being settled by leaving a confession near a hive and seeing which party the bees landed on. If they landed on you, the village might say the bees knew you spoke truth, and you start to realise this isn't just about bugs, this is about balance. Medieval life was fragile. Weather, war, illness, they could crush a town overnight, so people clung to anything that promised order, however small. The rules, even the bizarre ones, were scaffolding. Rituals gave shape to the unexplainable. And bees? Bees were perfect. They worked, they organised, they served the queen, they moved like a single mind. And if you broke the peace, they'd sting as one. You rise quietly from the churchyard, your feet still bare, and as you pass the hive, you whisper your own name, just in case. Because tonight you believe the bees are listening. You wake before dawn on your final day in the village, and something's changed. The streets, always soft with footsteps and low voices, are now lined with buckets of water and fresh-cut birch branches. Candles flicker in every window, not for light, but for ceremony. There's no festival music, no banners, just a strange anticipatory hush. A boy in a woolen cap runs past you barefoot, holding a bundle of herbs and a clay pot of ash. He pauses just long enough to whisper, "Don't touch the floor before sunrise." You blink. Why? He stares at you, puzzled. Because the floor remembers. You learn that today is the day of the threshold. And unlike saints' feasts or royal holidays, this one isn't on any church calendar. It's not sanctioned, written, or preached. But every villager follows it religiously. Why? Because of what happened 3 winters ago. No one says it directly. They just glance at the east gate, sealed with red wax and marked with a garland of thorns. You gather pieces of the story like breadcrumbs, an argument, a betrayal, something to do with a visitor who left before dawn and never came back. And ever since then, they say the village holds its breath on this day. Because betrayal passed through the threshold, and thresholds, in medieval belief, are alive. You remember something from an old manuscript you once read. The Latin word limen, meaning threshold, shares its root with liminality, the space between states, birth and death, inside and outside, innocence and guilt. Thresholds were considered spiritually unstable, vulnerable points of crossing where evil could slip in unnoticed. So today, no one steps barefoot from room to room until the blessing ash has been scattered. You watch the older women draw sigils across door frames. They tap each lintel 3 times, whispering a phrase that sounds like a blend of prayer and warning. In some homes, family members place shoes backwards just beyond the threshold to confuse malevolent spirits. In others, a broom is laid sideways, or a bowl of salt is tucked just beneath the door. One woman insists it's to catch the sorrow before it steps inside. And here's the truly strange part. This day differs by village. In one town it's midsummer, in another mid-Lent. Each place has its own date, its own story. But the rules are always similar. Quiet steps, covered thresholds, water and fire working together to seal the home from whatever lingers just beyond. You ask a farmer what would happen if someone ignored the custom, just walked out the front door barefoot without a prayer or pinch of salt. He winces. If they're lucky, nothing. If they're not, he shrugs. They won't see spring. And suddenly it all makes a crooked kind of sense. In a world without weather forecasts or burglar alarms or germ theory, the most dangerous place wasn't the graveyard. It was the gap beneath your own door. Because that's where the cold gets in. That's where the plague first knocks. That's where the soldiers march through when the walls fall. And so, bizarre as it seems, the rule holds. Protect the threshold, and the rest may follow. You go home that evening and place your own shoes at the door, heel first, just in case. Night has fallen, and the village is quieter than you've ever known it. Even the animals seem to understand. No braying, no howling, no wings against the shutters. Just the soft flicker of candlelight behind thick panes of glass and the scent of sage smoke drifting down the alleyways. You decide to take one last walk before leaving. Each door you pass bears a different ward. Some are simple, scratched crosses in the wood. Others are elaborate, small woven figures hung like ornaments, bundles of dried thyme wrapped in red string, bowls of oil reflecting the stars, and on each threshold a line of chalk. You hesitate before stepping over one. The markings feel sacred, not because you believe in magic, but because they're so deeply believed. That collective faith has weight. It's soaked into the stone. You remember what someone told you earlier? When enough people believe a rule, the world bends a little to make it true. You sit at the well in the centre of town and look up at the tower, where the bees have gone quiet for the night. The stillness is profound. Not empty, but watchful. And as your eyes adjust to the dark, you finally notice the village's hidden detail. Every building is slightly turned. No door directly faces the main path. Every threshold is angled, purposely askew. Another strange rule, but this one has an elegant reason. If evil walks in straight lines, as many believed, then slanting your home was a way to protect it, to confuse dark intent, to make your doorway less of a target and more of a puzzle. You think about all the rules you've learned here. Don't breathe over the dying, don't hammer during bee season, don't step barefoot across a threshold, and all of them at first glance seemed ridiculous, bizarre, medieval nonsense. But now, you see the wisdom beneath the weirdness. Because what are rules if not scaffolding for fear? What is ritual if not a flashlight in the dark? In a world of chaos, disease, famine, war, every strange rule was a way to hold back the unknown, to mark a boundary, to tell the wind, the wolves, the ghosts, you may go no farther. Even now you realise we do the same. We knock on wood. We avoid walking under ladders. We hold our breath when driving past graveyards. Modernity just wears better shoes. So you stand, brush off your coat and place your hand gently on the slanted lintel of the nearest door. You don't step through, you don't speak, you just pause. And in that stillness you understand what every villager knew without ever saying. The rules weren't about control, they were about care. Because when the world was full of sharp edges, a good rule was like a blanket. You wrapped it around your fear and called it home. And with that, you turn and head back, never once stepping across the chalk line. The fire is low now. The bees are asleep in their tower. The chalk lines have faded with dew, and the ancient streets of that strange little village have grown soft again under the hush of night. You've walked through rules that seemed foolish at first. Rules about pigs in the street, about not walking in boots, about where to bury your nail clippings, and maybe you smiled, maybe you scoffed, but now, in the gentle quiet of the dark, you understand. Every odd custom was a thread in a vast patchwork blanket of survival. Not superstition for its own sake, but for comfort, for connection, for giving people a way to feel in control of a world that often wasn't. A rule about bees wasn't just about bees, it was about preserving life. A law about soft shoes wasn't just about noise, it was about teaching reverence. Even the thresholds, the laughter, the invisible boundaries, they were all ways of saying, we are fragile and we are trying. Tonight, as you settle into your own bed, far from feasts and gallows and barefoot festivals, perhaps you'll remember one of those little rules, not because you have to, but because part of you now understands the tenderness behind them. So go ahead, dim the light, pull the blanket up, rest your feet gently on the floor before crawling under the covers, just in case someone long ago was right. Let the stillness hold you like a hive holds its honey. Let the bees dream quietly, and let their wings never stir too loud. Sleep well, time traveller. The rules will keep you safe,